It's been a little while since I've recorded a video, a few months. Just been very busy with stringing, so I thought I'd jump straight in with something a little bit different. Today it's tennis racket, and it's a Prince Graphite extender. Here's one which I did earlier. As you can see, the reason why I'm doing this video is because it looks on the offset like it's a very complicated racket to string. Lots of very weird little patterns here going around the frame. It's quite a wide profile. Here's the one which I'm going to be doing in a minute. But one thing which I'm not sure if you can pick up, but this racket has got a hard weave on it, so you can see the way that the mains are staggered right here. So you can see how the main strings are staggered, and also on the crosses they're all staggered. And this is a perfect example of how to demonstrate to somebody what a hard weave is. So a hard weave is effectively where you use the cross strings to find resistance on the main strings. So it's normally you try to, as a stringer, find the path with least resistance. For a hard weave, to start with and to finish with, you're actually looking for the path with the most resistance. And the reason why you do that is because you want the strings to stay in place. So when you thread the cross strings through, you want them to remain in place, give lots of stability. So on this racket, on the outside, those mains don't move a great deal because they're held in place, because they're on a hard weave over there. So it's just important to remember when you start the crosses on here to do everything in the right order, so that you're not going loosely through the main strings. You're suppressing them or pushing them up. Anyway, this actually isn't that difficult a racket to string. It looks like it's complex. It really isn't. You've just got to follow some simple rules around the outside. If it looks like it's wrong, then it probably is wrong, certainly for the mains anyway. And the crosses, as long as you start on that hard weave, which I'll show you in a moment, then you're onto a winner. So first of all, it's important to measure off the right amount of string for this racket. You've got 16 mains in this racket, and 20 plus crosses. Can't remember totally exactly how many crosses there are. should really count them, shouldn't I? But I do know. So it's really important that you get this all set up correctly. So first of all, mount the racket the correct way up with the Prince logo facing up on the butt of the racket. And then you get your cross strings, your main strings going through. Feed the first two through, and you'll know exactly which holes to put them through, because they're already staggered here anyway. Just for reference, I've used 4 long arm spans for the main strings and 4 for the crosses as well. There's quite a lot of string in here. Typically I would normally use about 3.5 arm spans of string for mains and crosses, depending on the racket type, but this is a very large head. It's an extender, so it takes, you know, probably a good metre more worth of string to string on this one. Now you can kind of clamp it off twice. You can pull the tension, then clamp it off. Personally, on this one, I'm using synthetic gut. I'm just going to just hold that in place. It's pre-clamped. Just pull tension here, works absolutely fine. You normally will get a little bit of movement on the first main with your clamps, just because there's a little bit more going through it. But for the ease of use, and for those who don't necessarily know all the fancy ways of using starting clamps on outside of rackets and things, this is just an easy way of doing it. And this is literally just following that process. There's no rocket science in this, although it looks really complex. There is no rocket science in this. So this is a racket which is pretty much a throwback to some of the crazy design influences of the early to mid 1990s. Prince were pretty prolific with the extender rackets in squash in the late 80s to mid 90s, and still actually use an extender powering version in their modern rackets today. But in tennis, I don't tend to see too many extenders or any Prince rackets with crazy frames. I'm just going to clamp this the other way around actually, just to give myself more access to that staggered hole. So another little tip there, just so you're not blocking yourself off too much, is sometimes just to reverse that clamp around on this racket. But yeah, Prince followed this from what they were doing with their squash technology at the early to mid 90s. I've actually got a bit of a unicorn Prince squash racket, which is here actually. So this is the Prince Extender Vortex in nearly perfect condition, and it actually uses exactly the same format of stringing with the hard weaves on and the staggered strings on the outside. Now this racket, this squash racket new, was between 150 to 200 pounds back in about 1994, 95. So in today's money that would equate to, I'd say, 300 pounds. So I'm actually not going to string that, about 300 pounds, which is an awful lot of money for a squash racket back then. The best modern squash rackets these days cost about 150 to 160 pounds if you're not sponsored or if you don't find a deal somewhere. For anybody watching in the US, just add a few numbers on to get dollars. So 150 pounds is probably about 180, 190 dollars, maybe a little bit more. But it just gives you an idea as to how much these rackets were going for. I think as opposed to looking at the racket technology now, a lot of companies focus a bit more energy on the quality of the rackets, getting them nice and stable, getting the balance right, and then trying to get the extra spin or endurance or playability through different types of string, as opposed to messing around with the frame. Really important, I'm not sure if you can see it, but where you've got the staggered strings here, it's really important just to make sure you're going through the right holes at the bottom. And you can tell if you are going through the right holes if the strings are leveling up parallel to each other, because there's some of the cross holes in the bottom, some of the cross grommets, which make life look a little bit tricky. And as you'll be noticing, I'm basically going a couple of strings ahead and then switching to the next side rather. I'm not going to tension this one because this is going to be my last main on this side, so come back through here, because what we ideally want to do is be as even as we can with tension spread going throughout there. So I'm just going to add an extra 10% of tension onto the side mains here, onto the final ones. You can actually get quite close to the frame here, so 10% is sufficient. Just make sure you pull the tie off pretty well when you're doing it, just to ensure you're not losing anything. Any tension rather whilst you're pulling off. So the string I'm using is actually Prince synthetic gut Duraflex on this one, so very classic Prince string, one which was requested by, just give me a good tug, one which was requested by the user. I use Prince Duraflex a lot actually in tennis rackets for people that have got slight elbow issues, or if they want a bit more pop. And racquetball it's great with as well, because you hit the ball fairly flat with racquetball. It just seems to last forever and performs well. So you can use it in either, not really so sure on squash, but so you pull some good tension on the side there, not moving too much. It's pretty good. And for reference on the tension here, I'm stringing the whole racket at 55 pounds tension on an electronic Wilson Bardo light machine. Yeah, I could probably stick it up to about 60 to 65 quite comfortably on this frame, but it is a slightly older frame, and I always get a little bit nervous putting too much tension on a frame which is 20 plus years old. You know, you've got to look after this. Well, there aren't too many in there. So this is where we come to the hard weave. Now I'm not sure if you can see on here, but I'll tell you what, if I get the racket which I've done. So what we want to be doing is going under on these first strings. So you can see it's pushing that string up there. So don't go for the easiest route. The easiest route would be just to go over where the stagger is there. But you want to go under. And then it'll be over on the last one, because the staggered system here alternates on each side. So you'll find that for the first couple, this is why I'm doing 2 in the first before I clamp off and start it. Find that for the first couple it is a little bit awkward, just because of the hard weave. It does create a bit of resistance. You can see there, it's hard to pull that through entirely. Again, like I was saying, I mean, you can't finger weave this one particularly easily to start with until the strings are suppressed a little bit. Let's just quickly add a bit of extra tension, pull the first 2, so you can see it really gets in there. Always just wiggle it about a bit, get it just right. We're going to retension that top main in a moment anyway when we tie that off. I wouldn't recommend on a racket with this much tension and this size of frame. I wouldn't recommend personally using a starting knot on this racket, just because I think it will probably eat into the grommets a little bit too much. Always try to prefer using a clamp on that top cross to start it off. Again, what you will see is it gradually becomes a little bit easier as the strings start to compact down a little bit. And it's not actually that difficult to string this racket once you get used to them. I mean, I do a few similar rackets in squash and in racquetball, some fairly complex rackets. Right, just adding a bit of extra tension to that top cross. Again, we can get quite close to the frame on this one, so no need to worry about losing too much tension on that top one. And it is really important to make sure the tension's good at the top. One thing I would say about this racket, because it is a hard weave the whole way down, is try to keep on top of keeping those cross strings straight whilst you're pulling tension. If you don't, then it can be quite awkward to get them straight afterwards, and you also lose a ton of tension if you let it have the kind of smiley face going all the way down. So you want it as dead straight as you can, so keep adjusting and pulling those strings as you go through. You can see as I'm doing it here, but because it's a hard weave and because it's stringing crosses, they naturally get pushed down a little bit. So yes, you're going to need to adjust afterwards using the awl, but you can do yourself a few favours going through. The other good thing with using synthetic gut is it's actually one of the easiest strings to weave with as well, especially if you've, like me, had quite a few fairly tricky string jobs recently, like bulk numbers of head Prestige MPs with and pros. Actually, I've done Prestige MPs and pros recently with fairly tight stringing patterns, especially on the 18 main rackets, using Solinco Hyper G 1.25, which is quite interesting. Great string, great rackets, but that combination's a bit of a tricky customer. As well as that, using confidential as well. I've had a few rackets recently which have been the kind of perfect storm of ripping fingers to shreds with tight string patterns and sharp strings. Thankfully, no Dunlop Black Widow to string with this week, which is a bit of a godsend. I think that would just probably finish the fingers off. Be interesting really to see if anybody strings these rackets on a regular basis. I'll probably string this type of racket maybe 5-6 times a year, and that includes doing this guy's rackets for him a couple of times a year. So it's really not a common racket, maybe because they've just died out, been broken, been left inside an old tennis club somewhere. I don't know, but it'd be interesting to see if anybody else gets these, because I know the majority of the Prince stringing patterns and rackets now tend to be a lot more simplistic. Some really nice rackets actually. They seem to have gone on the more kind of dainty side of the frames, not quite the thicker profiles that this racket has. It's also quite nice, right, in tennis. I mean, I string large numbers of, especially large numbers of squash, but also large numbers of tennis rackets, racquetball rackets, and quite a lot of badminton rackets as well. I pretty much do everything. And I love tennis rackets, I love tennis strings. You know, you can tell the quality on some over the others. But the one thing I really miss with tennis rackets, certainly the modern ones, is that there's not a huge amount of difference between the frames, very much like badminton as well, really. You'll get some slight idiosyncrasies, some slight differences, but you know, when you're stringing squash, you know that hardly any of the frames are the same. You get a couple of types which are similar, but it's nice to string something a little bit different. But the racquetball manufacturers, they probably need to dial it down just a little bit. Again, anybody that's watching this who's strung racquetball rackets before, I'd probably say 1 in every 3 racquetball rackets has got a ridiculous design, like the E-Forces, the Echelons, some of the Wilsons where they've got the grips, where you have to remove the grip to place the actual strings through the grip. There's some really bonkers stuff out there, but hey, all good fun. Lots of people quite often ask for stringing patterns for rackets. You know, how do they string a certain racket? Is there much difference? Well, this is one of those rackets which I think for the average person, if you hadn't strung this racket before and you just took a look at the racket with all the different holes staggered all over the place, and you know, what the hell do you do? This is a really good example of learning how to string a racket without using a stringing pattern, using a bit of trial and error, maybe doing a bit of research. I mean, no doubt there may be some people that want to follow some of my guidance on this. It's obviously not an instructional video. This is how I do it, just to demonstrate. But yeah, just top tip before you before you go searching for string patterns online, or before you ask thousands of people how they do it, you'll probably get thousands of different answers because we all string a little bit differently. Have a go. You'll become a better stringer. You'll become a better stringer by working a few things out yourself. This is just to really show you that it's not as hard as you may think when you first see it. I'm seeing a few strings that could be just pushed up a little bit. This is actually the player I'm stringing these rackets for. This is his string, so he's given me his reel of Duraflex, Prince Duraflex to use. I've got the same stuff, but I tend to buy mine in the optic yellow colour, which I think is pretty cool. Another little note, I mean, I tend to wiggle the string when I'm pulling it through a bit as well, just to try to reduce the amount of friction on the string to look after it a bit better. Again, the good thing with Prince Duraflex is it's a lot smoother. It's not as abrasive as using something like Solinco Confidential, Black Widow, or some of the other strings, maybe some of the rough strings as well, like Ali Power Rough. So, you know, you don't need to worry too much about burning that string. But what I would say is still do it. It's best practice. Still give it a good wiggle, and don't pull it through too fast. You pull it through too fast, then you create that friction. Then it starts creating notches. I think I'm not going to have enough string to do one ahead for the last couple. So we're nearly done. So it's going to be under well under 25 minutes to string this racket. I haven't tried to go particularly fast on this racket. I've been talking most of the way through. I talked for a couple of minutes or so before I started stringing it. So it's not a particularly difficult racket to string, this one. I'm just going to add some more tension at the end. And again, another little top tip for the final cross at the bottom is always add a bit more tension on the end of it. Reason being is some players like to use the vibration dampeners at the throat. If your final cross is loose and wiggly, it's not going to keep the vibration dampener in place. So you're going to get people putting the dampener, you know, between the last two cross strings, which for any sticklers to the rules, you're not actually allowed to do that. You're supposed to have it below the final cross. I see loads of players doing that though. They don't tend to be reprimanded for it, but you know, I'm sure if somebody was playing a tournament in the pros and they were caught on camera with doing it, then hey, maybe they'd be penalised for it or told to change it up. But I haven't seen it yet. Again, if you have seen it, comment. It'd be interesting to see if that's a rule which is actually stuck to. Just gonna keep that frame nice and tight, snip it off, just make sure the string is tight. Now this is quite interesting actually, because the strings are kept in place really well using this hard weave system that Prince have got. And it's a way of actually retaining some control of the racket, retaining some control on the racket whilst having a larger sized head, because it means that you're not getting quite so much of the huge trampoline effect on the outside. So if you think about the head TI, TIS 6s and those types of rackets with similar size heads on them, they don't have the hard weaves on the outside of the frame, so you know it's just going to be a power machine, just easy to plough through that ball without retaining too much control. This will give you tons of power, but you'll also get a fair bit of control with it as well. And always good to get the strings straight as soon as you've finished stringing, because what you don't want to do is have the strings kind of notch up afterwards. Because once they notch in place, they'll just find their way back to that same place again and again. And if this is done right, this one will ping a little bit louder or a little bit higher pitch than the first one, just on the basis that I've just taken this off the machine. Tiny bit different. So this racket, the first one I strung about an hour ago. This one a little bit after. So the one I've just strung, tiny bit higher pitch, that's good, because it means in the next half an hour or so it'll settle down and you'll have two rackets that have got exactly the same tension. So there we go. 2-piece as well, by the way, in case you haven't seen. So that's it. The Prince Graphite Extender.